Hello and welcome. Settle in, because today's story is the kind that makes you look twice at your own morning walk. There is nothing more dangerous, they say, than a habit. Not a knife, not a poison, not a locked door in the night. Just a habit. The same path, the same hour, the same quiet corner of a garden, walked so many times that no one, not even the person walking it, ever thinks to ask why. An elderly woman is found dead in her rose garden, on the walk she has taken every single morning for 30 years. No one saw it happen. No one heard a thing. And that, Hercule Poirot will discover, was never an accident of bad luck. It was the entire plan. If murder mysteries where the victim's own routine becomes the trap are your kind of story, stay with me. This one's a slow, careful unraveling, exactly how Poirot likes it. Now, let us begin. The discovery. The dew had not yet lifted from the rose garden at Hollow Thorn Manor when Agnes Pruitt found her mistress lying among the damasks, quite still, quite silent, and quite dead. It was a few minutes past 7. Agnes had brought the tray up to Mrs. Eleanor Vantry's room, as she had done every morning for 11 years, only to find the bed already made and the room empty, which was not in itself alarming. Mrs. Vantry rose at 5:30 without fail, and by 6 she was always in the garden, walking the same gravel path between the hedges, out past the sundial, round by the old stone wall, and back again in time for her tea at 7. It was the sort of habit the whole household could set a clock by, and several of them, in fact, did. But at 7 the tea grew cold on the tray, and by 1:15, Agnes, feeling a small, nagging unease she could not yet name, went down through the side door into the garden to see what was keeping her. She found her at the second turning past the sundial, where the yew hedges rose taller than a man's head and pressed close on both sides, leaving barely room for 2 people to pass abreast. Mrs. Vantry lay on her side among the fallen petals, one hand still loosely curled around the handle of her walking stick, her straw hat resting a few feet away, as though it had rolled there gently rather than been thrown. Agnes did not scream. She would tell the constable later that she had simply stood very still for what felt like a long while, and then walked back to the house at an ordinary pace, because some part of her mind had refused, quite firmly, to believe what her eyes were telling her. By 9 o'clock, Hollow Thorn Manor was a house transformed. Constable Whitfield had cycled up from the village, taken one look, and telephoned through to the station at Ashcombe for the police surgeon. The family had gathered in the morning room in the particular hush that settles over a household when no one is yet permitted to say the word that is in every mind. There was Rupert Vantry, the nephew, pale and upright by the window, turning his signet ring round and round on his finger. There was his wife, Margaret, who wept quietly into a handkerchief that never seemed to grow any wetter. There was the younger niece, Dorothy, barely 20, sitting very straight, with her hands folded, her eyes dry and strangely watchful. And there was old Mr. Feathers, the estate's long-time solicitor, who had driven over the moment word reached him, and who now stood by the mantel, with the particular stillness of a man doing sums in his head. An apoplexy, surely, Rupert said, for perhaps the 3rd time. She was 71. She'd had the turns before. Dr. Malden will tell you. Dr. Malden, said Mr. Feathers carefully, has not yet seen her. It was the police surgeon, a brisk young man named Cotter, who put an end to the comfortable theory of apoplexy. He knelt in the rose bed for the better part of 20 minutes, and when he rose, brushing the soil from his knees, his face had the flat, professional blankness of a man who has decided to say as little as possible until he is certain. "There's a wound," he said at last, to Whitfield, in a voice pitched low enough that it did not carry to the house. "Back of the skull. Could be a fall against the stone edging there. Could be something else. I shan't say more till I've had her properly looked at." It was, in the end, quite deliberately that he did not say more that morning. But Whitfield understood him well enough, and by noon a call had gone out to the county police, and by 3 o'clock a black car with a Scotland Yard driver had come up the long gravel drive, bringing with it Chief Inspector Japp, looking a good deal more travel-worn than he liked, and folded rather awkwardly into the passenger seat beside him, a small, egg-headed gentleman with an extraordinary moustache and an even more extraordinary sense of his own importance. "You didn't need to bring me all this way for a woman who fell on a garden path, Jap," Poirot said, straightening his waistcoat as he climbed out of the car and surveyed the house with the faint, appraising disapproval of a man who found the English countryside charming in theory and damp in practice. "That's just it, though, isn't it?" said Jap, already walking toward the door. "Cotter doesn't think she fell. Wound's in the wrong place for that. Too far back, too clean, and there's not a soul in this house who'll admit to seeing her after 6 this morning, though half of them were up and about the grounds by then, if the maid's to be believed." Poirot said nothing to this at once. He stood for a moment at the edge of the drive, looking not at the house, grand, grey, unremarkable in the way of 100 such houses, but at the hedges that rose beyond it, dark green and impossibly tall, dividing the garden into what he could already see, even from this distance, were a series of narrow, private little rooms, open to the sky and closed to every eye but the birds. "A woman," he said slowly, "who walks the same path, at the same hour, every day of her life, for 30 years. Tell me, Jap, is there anything in this world more predictable than an old English lady and her habits?" "Can't think of one," Jap admitted. "Nor can I," said Poirot, and something in the quiet, careful way he said it made Jap glance at him twice. "Which is precisely, my friend, what troubles me." They walked in together, past Constable Whitfield at the door, into a house that had, in the space of a single morning, gone from the ordinary business of breakfast trays and garden walks to something else entirely, and where, Poirot was already quite certain, someone within its walls knew a good deal more about Eleanor Vantry's habits than they had yet troubled to say. The Garden of Blind Corners. Poirot's first request, once he had been introduced to the assembled family with the small, precise bow that Jap had seen him give 100 times before, was not to interview anyone at all, but to be taken directly to the rose garden. "The body has been moved, of course," he said, as Whitfield led them through the side door Agnes had used that morning. "But the garden, she does not move. She keeps her secrets very well, gardens, until someone thinks to ask her properly." The path was exactly as Agnes had described it to Jap that morning. Gravel, raked smooth, running between hedges of dark yew that had clearly been allowed to grow untrimmed at the top for some years, so that they rose well above head height and leaned very slightly inward, giving the whole path the feeling of a green corridor. It bent twice before reaching the sundial, and twice more beyond it, each turning a blind one, so that a person walking it could see no more than a few yards ahead or behind at any point. Poirot walked the length of it slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, pausing at each turning to look first one way and then the other. "You see it, Jap? See what? Hedges. Precisely. Hedges. And nothing else. From this second turning, where Madame Vantry was found, one cannot see the house. One cannot see the sundial. One cannot see the gate at the far end, nor the wall, nor the kitchen garden beyond. A person could stand in this exact spot, Jap, and commit whatever act they pleased, and be seen by no one, provided only that they knew, to the minute, when their victim would arrive. And that's the trouble, isn't it?" said Jap, crouching by the stone edging where the worst of the disturbed earth still lay. "Everyone in that house knew when she'd arrive. Half the village knew. The woman was regular as the church bells, regular to a fault, from what the maid tells me." Poirot did not answer at once. He had moved to the hedge itself and was examining, with the particular close attention he gave to things other men overlooked, a section where several of the inner branches had been snapped and left hanging, not torn away entirely, but broken and pushed aside, as though someone had once stood concealed within the hedge itself, in a shallow hollow just large enough for a person to stand pressed flat against the yew. "Someone," he murmured, "has stood here before, not this morning only. See how the broken branches, They are old, brown already, not green. This is not the work of one day, Jap. This is a place someone has used more than once. Jap came to look and grunted his agreement. Watching her, you think? Learning her habits? Perhaps. Poirot straightened, brushing a fleck of bark from his sleeve with visible distaste. Or perhaps simply waiting for the right morning to come. A creature of habit, Madame Vantry, but a creature of habit is dangerous only to herself if no one troubles to notice the pattern. Someone noticed it, Jap. Someone noticed it very well indeed. They walked back to the house as the afternoon light was beginning to slant long and gold across the lawn, and it was here, over tea that none of the family seemed inclined to drink, that Poirot had his first proper look at the household of Hollow Thorn Manor. Rupert Vantry, he decided within the first 5 minutes, was a man accustomed to being believed without being questioned, and did not care at all for the reversal of that arrangement. He spoke of his aunt with a grief that seemed genuine enough, but larded it, rather too heavily for Poirot's taste, with remarks about the estate. Who would manage it now? What would become of the tenant farms? Whether the solicitor had yet located the will. "You are close friends with Monsieur Feathers, I think," Poirot observed mildly, watching Rupert's face rather than his words. "Feathers has handled the family's affairs for 30 years. Of course we're close. And the will, you know already what it contains." "I should hope I do. I'm her nephew." Her only nephew. A small, unconscious lift of the chin. There was never any question of it going elsewhere. Margaret Vantry said very little, and what she did say was so carefully unremarkable that Poirot found himself, by the third exchange, more interested in her silences than in Rupert's talk. She wept, but she wept in the manner of a woman performing an emotion she believed was expected of her, rather than one she was drowning in, or so it seemed to Poirot, though he was careful, even in his own mind, to hold the thought loosely. Grief wore many faces, and he had been wrong about a face before. It was Dorothy, the niece, who interested him most. She answered his questions directly, without the small evasions and softenings the others employed, and there was, beneath her composure, something that struck him as closer to anger than to sorrow. "You did not care for your aunt?" he asked her, quite gently, when the others had drifted from the room. "I loved her," Dorothy said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. "That is not the same thing as caring for the way she lived. She had rules for everything, Monsieur Poirot. Rules for breakfast, rules for the garden, rules for who might speak to her before 10 in the morning. She built herself a life with no surprises in it whatsoever, and I used to tell her, only last month I told her, that a life with no surprises in it was a life half-lived. And now," said Poirot softly, "it seems the lack of surprise is precisely what has cost her." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, and something in her steady grey eyes made him think, not for the first time that afternoon, that this quiet household held rather more beneath its surface than its members had yet troubled to show him. The shape of a habit. By evening, Poirot had asked to see, not the family again, but the household, the people whose lives ran quietly beneath the families, and who so often, in his long experience, saw a great deal more of the truth, for being so seldom asked their opinion of it. He began with Agnes Pruitt, who received him in the small sitting-room off the kitchen, with the particular rigid politeness of a servant, unused to being addressed, as though her observations mattered. "You have been with Madame Vantry 11 years, I am told." 11 years this March, sir." "Then you know her habits better, perhaps, than her own family." Agnes considered this with evident surprise, as though the thought had not occurred to her before, and then nodded slowly. "I suppose I do, sir. She never varied, you see. Up at 5:30, dressed by 6, in the garden by 6, out again by 7 for her tea, sharp. She used to say a life run to the clock was a life that couldn't run away from you." A small, unhappy laugh. "I never thought much on it before. It sounds different, saying it now. And her walk, always the same path, the same direction. Always the same, sir. Out past the sundial, round by the wall, back again, rain or shine. I did ask her once, when the weather was very bad, whether she mightn't walk in the hall instead, and she looked at me as though I'd suggested she take her tea standing on her head. Poirot smiled faintly at this, though his eyes remained thoughtful. And who else in this house, Agnes, knew this pattern as well as you? Everyone, sir. It wasn't a secret. The gardener set his work round it. Wouldn't touch the rose beds till after she'd had her walk. Out of respect, he said. Cook had her tea ready to the minute. Even the doctor knew it. Dr. Malden used to say he could set his watch by her better than by the church clock. This last detail Poirot turned over with particular care. Dr. Malden, he attended her regularly. Once a fortnight, sir, for her heart. She'd had some trouble with it these 2 years past. Nothing serious, the doctor always said, but he liked to keep an eye. He was here only yesterday afternoon, as it happens. Dr. Malden, when Poirot found him an hour later in the small consulting room he kept in the village, proved to be a heavy-set, weathered man in his 50s, with the brisk, faintly impatient manner of a country doctor who had long ago run out of patience for anything he considered fuss. Heart trouble, yes, he said, when Poirot raised the matter. Nothing that should have killed her in a rose garden, if that's what you're asking. She had good years left in her, barring accidents. And yet, said Poirot mildly, there was, it seems, an accident. Malden's face tightened. So I hear. I'll say this much, Monsieur Poirot. If someone did do for her, they'd have known her heart was weak. It wouldn't have taken much of a shock to finish the job, on top of a blow, a fright even. She was not a strong woman, for all her stubbornness. You visited her yesterday afternoon, I am told. I did, same as every fortnight. A pause, and something in it, brief, almost imperceptible, caught Poirot's attention like a snagged thread. We discussed her prescription, nothing more. Nothing more, Poirot repeated, very gently, and let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable. A small trick he had used 1,000 times before, and which worked, more often than not, exactly as it worked now. She mentioned changing her will, Malden said abruptly, as though the words had been sitting behind his teeth the whole conversation. Asked my opinion on a codicil of all things, whether a shock to the nerves could bring on a heart attack in someone in her condition. I thought it an odd sort of question at the time. I didn't think much more of it till this morning. Poirot's moustache gave the smallest twitch, the outward sign, Jap would have told you, of a mind that had just been handed something it considered extremely interesting. And did she say, doctor, in whose interest such a change might be? She did not, and I did not ask. It is not, Monsieur Poirot, a doctor's place to pry into a patient's family affairs. He said this with the particular firmness of a man who had, in fact, wondered a great deal about it since, and disliked himself faintly for not having asked when he had the chance. It was the gardener, old Tom Hartwell, who gave Poirot the detail that would occupy his mind for the better part of the evening. Found at last in the potting shed, cleaning his tools with the unhurried care of a man who had outlived a great many crises and did not intend to let this one disturb his routine. Hartwell answered Poirot's questions with the flat, unadorned honesty of someone who had never learned, or never troubled, to dress up the truth. Someone's been in that hedge before, sir, if that's what you're asking. I noticed the break in the branches a fortnight back, maybe more. Thought it was foxes, at first, or the boy from the village creeping in after apples, though there's no apples that end of the garden to speak of. You did not think to mention it to Madame Vantry? Didn't think it worth the bother, sir. Things break in a garden. I meant to trim it back proper, only I never got round to it. He shook his head slowly. Wish to God I had now. You have no notion who it might have been. Hartwell hesitated, the first hesitation Poirot had seen from him, and then said, carefully, as a man picking his way across uncertain ground, "There's been a young fellow about the lanes these past weeks, not from the village. I saw him twice, maybe 3 times, hanging about near the wall by the kitchen garden. The wall runs close by that hedge, sir, closer than you'd think. Never came to the house, never said what he wanted. I only saw him the once close to, and that was near dusk, so I couldn't say much for a description beyond he was young, and city-dressed, not a farming man. It was a small thing, a stranger glimpsed twice near a garden wall, in a county where strangers were, by their very nature, remarked upon. And yet Poirot felt, as he thanked Hartwell and walked back toward the house in the gathering dark, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has just been handed the first loose thread of a knot that will, in time, come entirely undone. He did not yet know where the thread led, but he intended, before the week was out, to follow it to its very end. A question of minutes. It was the matter of timing that occupied Poirot through the whole of the following morning, and it was the matter of timing, in the end, that led him, for 2 full days, very confidently astray. He had asked Japp to establish, as precisely as the household could manage it, the movements of every person at Hollow Thorn Manor between 5:30 and 7 o'clock on the morning of the murder. It was, he knew, a delicate business. People remembered such things imperfectly, even under ordinary circumstances. And a death in the house had a way of scrambling memory further, each person unconsciously reshaping their own account to seem a little less suspicious, a little more innocent than the plain truth might allow. Cook placed herself in the kitchen from 5 o'clock onward, preparing the tea tray, and this much Agnes could confirm. The housemaid, a nervous girl named Sally, had been laying fires upstairs and had seen no one in the garden at all. Old Hartwell had been in the potting shed by 5:30, as was his habit, and had heard nothing over the sound of his own work. It was Rupert Vantry's account that gave Poirot pause. Rupert claimed to have risen at 6 and taken a short walk of his own, not in the rose garden, he was careful to specify, but along the drive toward the front gate, to clear his head before breakfast, a habit he said he kept most mornings. No one had seen him do it. He had, by his own account, returned to the house a little before 7, in time to be told of the discovery. A convenient sort of walk, Japp observed, when Rupert had left them, with no one to vouch for either end of it. Convenient indeed, Poirot agreed. And yet, Japp, consider, the drive runs along the front of the house, quite in the open. A man walking there might easily be seen from any of a dozen windows, and yet claims he was not. Either he is telling the truth, and was simply unlucky in his lack of witnesses, or he is lying, and has chosen the one story that cannot be disproven, because it is also the one story that cannot be proven. There was, further, the matter of the will. Feathers, pressed gently but persistently over the course of that second day, had at last confirmed what Poirot had already begun to suspect, that Eleanor Vantry had indeed summoned him some 3 weeks previously to discuss an alteration to her will, though she had died, as far as he knew, before any new document was signed. She gave no indication of her intentions? Poirot pressed. She asked a great many questions about Dorothy's inheritance, Feathers admitted, with evident reluctance. Whether it could be increased without touching Rupert's share of the estate itself, the land, that is, which was always intended for him. I formed the impression, though she never said it outright, that she meant to leave Dorothy a considerably larger sum than the original will provided. And Rupert? Did he know of this? I could not say. I certainly did not tell him. But servants talk, Monsieur Poirot, and solicitors' letters do not always stay as private as we should like. By that evening, Poirot found himself circling, with increasing conviction, around a picture that fit together with a neatness he ought perhaps to have distrusted rather more than he did. A nephew whose inheritance stood suddenly and substantially at risk, who could account for none of his movements at the critical hour, and who had, moreover, been observed by Sally the housemaid, a detail she offered almost apologetically, as though ashamed to have noticed it, standing at his bedroom window a little after 6, looking out toward the garden with an expression she could only describe as watchful. "He is our man, I think," Poirot said to Japp that night, over a rather indifferent glass of the local claret. "The motive is plain, the opportunity is unaccounted for, and a man does not stand at his window watching a garden for nothing, at that hour, on that morning of all mornings. "You sound almost certain," Japp said, though something in Poirot's own tone gave him pause even as he said it. "Almost, my friend," said Poirot slowly, setting down his glass. "Almost is a dangerous word. In my profession, I have been almost certain before, and been made to look a great fool for it." He frowned, turning the stem of the glass between his fingers. "There is a piece that does not fit, Japp, and I have been, how do you say it, sweeping it under the rug, because the rest of the picture pleases me so well. I do not care for a picture that pleases me before it has earned the right." "What piece?" "The stranger," said Poirot slowly. "The young man Hartwell saw near the wall. He does not fit anywhere in the tidy story I have just told you. And a detective who discards an inconvenient piece merely because it spoils a convenient picture, Japp, that is not a detective. That is a man in love with his own cleverness. I have been that man before also, and I did not care for it then either." He rose, straightening his waistcoat with brisk, decisive movements, the momentary doubt already hardening into resolve. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will find out who this young man is. And then, Japp, I think we shall discover whether my convenient picture is the true one, or whether I have simply been walking, like our unfortunate Madame Vantry, down a very familiar and very comfortable path, without troubling to ask what waits around the corner." The second warning. The stranger was found the following afternoon, though it would be truer to say he found them, arriving at Hollow Thorn Manor, unannounced and considerably agitated, asking for Poirot by name at the front door, in a manner that suggested a man who had spent a sleepless night, working up his courage, and did not entirely trust it to last the journey. He gave his name as Edward Norse, and proved, on questioning, to be a young clerk from a London solicitor's firm, not Feathers's own, but a rival practice, with which, it transpired, Rupert Vantry had corresponded rather more extensively over the past 2 months than his aunt had ever known. He was perhaps 24, thin in the wrists, with the particular pallor of a young man who spent his days indoors among ledgers and his evenings, Poirot suspected, worrying about them. "I wasn't spying," Norse said miserably, twisting his hat in his hands in the morning room, with Japp and Poirot seated opposite him like a small tribunal. "That is, I was, but not for any wicked purpose. Mr. Ashford, my employer, had me making certain inquiries about the estate's boundaries. A question of an old right-of-way along the wall, nothing more. I came out from London twice to look at the ground myself, and I'll admit I kept out of sight doing it, because Mr. Ashford didn't want it known his firm was involved, not until matters were settled. He's very particular about that sort of thing, says a solicitor who lets his interest be known too early, loses half his advantage. A cautious employer, Poirot observed, settling back in his chair with the air of a man content to let a nervous witness talk himself gradually toward the truth. "And you, Monsieur Norse, did you share his caution, or merely obey it?" "I obeyed it, sir, though I didn't much care for creeping about a stranger's garden wall of an evening, if I'm honest. Felt a proper fool, more than once, crouched down behind the hedge like a boy stealing apples." A faint, unhappy laugh escaped him. "Old Hartwell nearly caught me the second time. I heard him coming, and had to lie flat in the ditch till he'd passed by with his barrow." "And what did you observe in these 2 visits that might be of interest to us now?" Norse frowned, considering. "Nothing I thought signified at the time, sir. I saw the old lady out walking once, from a distance, very upright, very particular in her step, like she was following a line drawn on the ground. And I saw the young lady, Miss Dorothy, in the garden another time, though she didn't see me. That's all, sir, truly. I was there for the wall, not the house. Mr. Vantry had been in discussion with your firm, I understand, about a loan," Poirot said, changing course with the easy, deceptive gentleness that Japp had long since learned to recognize as the most dangerous point in any of Poirot's interviews. Norse's discomfort deepened visibly, and his hands stilled on the brim of his hat. "I only learned yesterday, From the newspaper, what had happened here, he said, not quite answering. I came at once. I didn't want it thought I had anything to do with that. I only wanted to see the wall. You have not answered my question, Monsieur Norse. The young man swallowed. Mr. Vantry had been in discussion with us, sir, yes. About borrowing against the estate. Against land he didn't yet own outright, if you take my meaning. He needed the money rather urgently, from what I understood. Mr. Ashford said as much to me once, in passing, though he'd likely skin me for repeating it. And the loan was contingent on his inheriting the property, free and clear, without complication. He looked up, anxious. That's all I know, sir. I'm only a clerk. I copy letters and check boundary maps. Nobody tells a clerk the whole of anything. It was, on its face, a small and rather pathetic confession. A young man's carelessness about his employer's confidential business, nothing more. But it dropped a new and unwelcome weight onto the scale already tipped against Rupert Vantry. A nephew short of money. A nephew whose inheritance was suddenly, urgently necessary to him, not merely desirable. And an aunt who had, in the very weeks before her death, begun quietly arranging to divert a substantial portion of that inheritance elsewhere. Poirot thanked Norse, sent him on his way, with strict instructions to remain in the district until the inquiry was concluded, a request the young man received with visible relief, as though merely having told his small, guilty secret to someone in authority had lifted a weight considerably larger than the secret itself warranted, and turned to Japp with an expression that Japp had learned, over many years, to read as deep and uncomfortable thought. It fits together very neatly now, does it not, Japp? Neat as a pin, Japp agreed. Man needs money badly. Aunt's about to cut his share. He watches her habits, waits his moment, does the deed in a corner of the garden, where no one could possibly see him do it. I'd call that a case, Poirot, and a strong one. So would I, said Poirot, and something in his voice made Japp look up sharply. That is precisely what troubles me about it. He said no more on the subject that evening, though he ate his dinner with the distracted air of a man chewing over something considerably less digestible than the meal in front of him. But that night, a little after 11, the household was woken by Dorothy Vantry's cry from the small sitting room she had taken to using since her aunt's death, a room that overlooked, as it happened, a corner of the very garden in which Eleanor Vantry had died. She had found, tucked beneath the door, a single sheet of plain paper, the message upon it composed of letters cut, with evident care, from the pages of a newspaper. Ask no more questions, or you will walk the same path. The household was thrown, by this, into a fresh and considerably sharper state of alarm than the murder itself had produced. For a death in a garden, however shocking, had about it something already finished, already past. A threat delivered in the dead of night to a living girl was a danger still very much unfolding. Cook insisted, over Agnes's protests, on sitting up with a poker across her knees outside Dorothy's door for the remainder of the night. Rupert, white-faced, wanted the whole house searched at once, room by room, and had to be persuaded by Japp that such a search, conducted at midnight by frightened amateurs, was more likely to trample useful evidence than to find any. Poirot examined the note with great care by lamplight, turning it over twice, holding it to the light to study the cut edges of the pasted letters, before setting it down with a small, dissatisfied frown. Curious, he murmured. Curious how? Japp asked. Looks a plain enough threat to me. It is too plain, my friend. It is the threat of a person who has read a great many detective novels and knows precisely what such a note ought to say. Real fear, real malice in a hurry. It does not often stop to cut letters so neatly from a newspaper at 11 o'clock at night, matching each one carefully so that the size does not vary too greatly from line to line. It takes time, patience, a steady hand. A person in genuine terror of discovery does not usually have such things to spare. They act in haste, and haste leaves its mark. Smudged glue, torn edges, letters of mismatched size, snatched from whatever page came first to hand. This note was made with care, Jap, and care is not the handwriting of panic. You think it's false? A blind? I think, said Poirot slowly, that someone in this house wishes very much for us to believe that Mademoiselle Dorothy is in danger, and I am not yet certain whether that is because she truly is, or because someone finds it useful that we should think so. He looked up, and in the lamplight his dark eyes were very grave. Either way, Jap, we must take precautions tonight, as though the danger were entirely real. A theory of a false threat that turns out to be true is a luxury I have no wish to afford. Whitfield may sit outside her door himself, and Cook may keep her poker if it comforts her, though I think, in the end, we shall find the true danger in this house was never the sort that announces itself with a note beneath a door. The crack. It was Constable Whitfield, of all people, who supplied the detail that undid Poirot's tidy case against Rupert Vantry, though he did not know, when he mentioned it, that he was undoing anything at all. He came to Poirot on the second morning after the note, apologetic and faintly embarrassed, holding a small ledger book in his hands. "I don't know that it signifies anything, sir," he said, "but I thought you'd want to see it regardless. It's the milkman's round book. He leaves it with Cook each morning, and she initials for the delivery. I only thought to check it because my sergeant likes everything accounted for, times and all, when there's been a death in a house. It's a habit of his, sir, checking the small things. Says the small things are half of what a case is made of." "Your sergeant," Poirot said, taking the book with evident interest, "sounds like a man of excellent sense." Whitfield flushed with a pleasure he tried, not entirely successfully, to disguise as professional modesty, and Poirot turned his attention to the ledger, running one gloved finger down the neat columns of dates and initials until he found the entry against the date of the murder. A delivery time of 6:11, and beneath it, Cook's initials, and beneath that, in the milkman's own hand, added as an afterthought in slightly cramped, hurried script, a small note: "Saw Mr. R. Vantry at the front gate, 6:15 or thereabouts, walking down toward the lane. Wished him good morning." He seemed in low spirits. Poirot sat with this for a long moment in perfect stillness, reading it a second time, and then a third, as though he suspected the words might rearrange themselves into some more convenient shape if he looked at them long enough. They did not, and at last he said quietly, "Jap, I believe I have made an error." "What sort of error?" "I have assumed," Poirot said slowly, setting the ledger down upon the table with the particular care of a man handling something suddenly very fragile, that because a man could offer no witness to his innocence, he must therefore be guilty of concealing his guilt. "But here is a witness, Jap, that neither Rupert Vantry nor any of us thought to seek, because none of us thought to ask a milkman what he saw on his round. 6:15, at the front gate, walking away from the house, toward the lane, not toward the rose garden at all. If this is accurate, Rupert Vantry could not have reached the second turning of that garden path, struck his aunt, and returned to his room to be seen at the window by Sally, a little after 6, as she claims. The distances alone would not permit it." He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, standing with his back to the room for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had in it something Jap had rarely heard from him, a genuine, unguarded discomfort with his own reasoning. "I have built a tower, my friend, on a foundation of sand, because the sand was convenient, and I did not trouble to test it as I should have. It is a very human failing, Jap, and I do not exempt myself from human failings merely because I have made something of a profession of correcting them in others. A man who is too fond of the shape of his own conclusion, he stops asking the questions that might spoil it. I was, I think, a little too fond." Jap, to his credit, did not gloat, though he might have been forgiven for it after 2 days of listening to Poirot build his case against Rupert with such evident satisfaction. "So the money troubles, the will, all of it, nothing?" "Not nothing," said Poirot, beginning to pace, a habit that overtook him whenever his mind was working hardest, back and forth across the small strip of carpet before the fireplace. A man may have every motive in the world and still not be the one who acts upon it. Rupert Vantry's difficulties are real, but they are not, I think now, the difficulties that killed his aunt. I have spent 2 days admiring my own cleverness in constructing his guilt, Jap. And all the while there was a milkman's book sitting in a kitchen drawer that would have told me, on the very first day, that my clever construction did not hold. I did not ask, because I did not think to ask, because I already believed I had my answer. That is a poor way to conduct an investigation, and I am somewhat ashamed of it. He stopped pacing abruptly, turning back to face Jap with renewed purpose, the momentary shame already hardening, as it always did with him, into fresh resolve. Sally, the housemaid. She said she saw him at the window a little after 6. Let us ask her again, Jap. And this time, let us ask her precisely how long after 6. To the very minute if she can manage it, and whether she is entirely certain it was Rupert's window, and not some other. Sally, questioned a second time in the small parlour where the family took their less formal meals, proved a good deal less certain under close examination than she had seemed under casual conversation. A common enough phenomenon in Poirot's experience, for witnesses were rarely dishonest so much as imprecise, filling gaps in genuine memory with assumptions that felt, to them, indistinguishable from fact. I couldn't rightly say the exact minute, sir, she admitted, twisting her apron between nervous fingers. It was early. The light was that grey colour it goes before the sun's properly up. I was crossing the landing with an armful of linen, and I saw someone at a window, and I thought, there's Mr. Rupert up early, and I didn't think no more of it, not till everyone started asking me questions and wanting to know exact times, which I never was one for keeping close track of, not with my work. And the window itself, Poirot pressed gently. You are certain it was his? She hesitated, and the hesitation told Poirot a good deal more than her answer did. It could have been another window, she admitted at last, distressed, her eyes filling. I couldn't swear to it now, sir, not the way I could a few days back. I'm that sorry. I never meant to say something that wasn't true, only everyone kept asking, and I wanted to be helpful, and I suppose I made myself more certain than I'd any right to be. You did not lie, mademoiselle, Poirot said gently. You remembered as well as any person remembers, which is to say, imperfectly, and with the unconscious help of a story already forming in your mind. It is not a fault, it is only a fact of how we are made. We none of us like an empty space in our memory, and so we fill it, without meaning to deceive, with whatever seems to belong there. I have made the very same error myself this week, only with a milkman's ledger instead of a landing window. Sally managed a small, watery smile at this, seeming to take some comfort from the notion that even the great Hercule Poirot was not above such ordinary human slips, and left the room a good deal lighter than she had entered it. But it left him once again without a suspect, and with a fresh and uncomfortable question turning over in his mind. If not Rupert, standing at his window watching the garden, then whose window had it been, and whose figure, glimpsed by a frightened girl in the pale early light, had she mistaken so readily for the nephew everyone had already half decided must be guilty? It was that evening, walking alone along the yew hedge in the last grey light before dusk, retracing for perhaps the 6th time the exact path Eleanor Vantry had walked every morning for 30 years, that Poirot stopped quite suddenly at the second turning and stood very still, looking not at the ground where she had fallen, but up, at the angle of the upper windows visible above the hedge-line from that one particular spot, and at one window in particular, which he had not, until this moment, thought to consider at all. He stood there a long while, quite motionless, the pieces of the case rearranging themselves in his mind, with the quiet, satisfying click of a key, finally turning in a lock that had resisted every wrong one tried before it. Ah, he said softly, to no one but the darkening garden. Ah, but of course. It was never a question of who could be seen, walking that path each morning, it was a question of who could see it, and had watched it, I think, far longer and far more carefully than any of us have yet troubled to ask. The path she knew too well. Poirot gathered the household in the drawing-room the following evening, as was his custom, with Japp standing quietly near the door, and Constable Whitfield stationed, discreetly, just beyond it. The family arranged themselves as they had on that first afternoon. Rupert by the window, Dorothy upright and watchful, Mr. Feathers by the mantel. But Margaret Vantry, Poirot noted, had chosen a chair a little apart from her husband, near the door, as though some part of her had already begun, without quite knowing why, to prepare for leaving. "I have spent these past days," Poirot began, "chasing a great many shadows, and I confess to you freely that I have, more than once, mistaken a shadow for the substance behind it. I believed, for a time, that Monsieur Rupert's difficulties with money made him our man. I was wrong, and a milkman's ledger corrected me before I did him a very great injustice." He inclined his head slightly toward Rupert, who said nothing, though something in his shoulders eased. "I believed also that the note left for Mademoiselle Dorothy was the work of a frightened murderer covering his tracks. I was wrong in that also, though not, I think, entirely wrong, for the note was indeed the work of someone in this house. Only not for the reason I first supposed." He began to walk slowly, the length of the room, his hands clasped behind him. "Let us consider, for a moment, everyone who sits in this room, and everyone who does not. Monsieur Feathers, you knew of the change to the will before any of the family did. A solicitor with knowledge of a fortune about to shift hands is always, in my experience, worth a long look. But you had held this family's confidence for 30 years, without once betraying it, and a man does not generally abandon a lifetime's discretion for a crime he could not hope to profit from directly. I set you aside." Feathers inclined his head stiffly, saying nothing, though a faint colour had risen in his weathered cheeks. "Mademoiselle Dorothy, you stood to gain the most from the change your aunt intended, and yet it is a poor sort of murderer who kills the very woman about to sign away a fortune in her favour, before the document is ever drawn up. Your aunt's death, as it happens, has very likely cost you the inheritance she meant for you, not secured it. A clumsy motive, and clumsier still for a young woman clever enough, I think, to have seen that difficulty long before I pointed it out to her." Dorothy said nothing, but her eyes did not leave him. "Monsieur Rupert, his motive I have already discussed, and already discarded, thanks to a milkman's careful hand with a pencil. Old Hartwell, the gardener, he had access to the hedge, certainly, and knowledge enough of the broken branches, but a man does not usually draw a stranger's attention to evidence of his own guilt, as he did so readily to me. Agnes, the maid, devoted by every account, for 11 years, and the first to find the body, which is precisely the position a guilty party generally avoids rather than seeks." He paused at the window, looking out toward the darkening garden. "So I returned, as I always must, to the habit itself, to the walk, the hour, the blind turning behind the hedge. Knowledge of a habit is not enough to kill by. One must know it with a certainty, not the general knowledge that she walks each morning, but the precise, practiced knowledge of exactly when she will reach that one turning, to within a minute or two, day after day, so reliably that one might plan, with confidence, to be waiting there." He turned from the window. "Old Hartwell told me of broken branches in the hedge, old enough to have been made weeks before the murder, evidence that someone had stood concealed there more than once, watching, or waiting, or simply learning the rhythm of Madame Vantry's walk as one learns a piece of music, through repetition. But a hedge is a cold and uncomfortable place to keep a long watch, and I began to ask myself whether the true watching had not been done from somewhere warmer, somewhere private, somewhere requiring no concealment at all, because the watcher had every right to be there." His eyes came to rest. gently, but without wavering, on Margaret Vantry. "Your sitting room, madam, overlooks the second turning of that path directly. The only room in this house that does. Sally the housemaid told us she saw a figure at an upstairs window a little after 6 on the morning of the murder, and assumed, because it suited the shape of the story we had already begun to build, that it was her master's window she had seen. But your window, madame, is nearer that garden turning than his by a considerable distance, and gives a clearer view of it besides. A woman might stand there every morning of her married life, quite innocently, watching the garden come awake, until one morning the watching became something else. Margaret Vantry had gone very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but she said nothing, and Poirot continued, his voice gentle but relentless. I asked myself also why a woman would take such trouble to warn Mademoiselle Dorothy of a danger that did not, I believed, truly exist, cutting letters from a newspaper with a careful hand in the dead of night. It is not the act of a murderer covering a trail, for a true murderer wishes attention drawn away from the household entirely, not deeper into it. But it is very much the act of a frightened woman who has done a terrible thing and cannot bear to see suspicion settle, even briefly, on an innocent girl she is fond of, and so contrives, clumsily, to frighten everyone into believing some outside danger still threatens this house, so that the search is drawn away from her own door. That is not, Margaret began, her voice very thin, and then stopped herself, pressing the handkerchief she had carried for days now hard against her mouth. I do not think you meant, at first, for it to end in death, Poirot said, more quietly now, and there was, beneath the precision of his manner, something almost kind in the way he said it. I think you learned, perhaps from careless words, perhaps overheard, perhaps told directly by Madame Vantry herself, who did not always guard her tongue with those she considered family, that she meant to alter her will, to take a substantial portion from the estate your husband had spent his whole life expecting, and give it to Mademoiselle Dorothy instead. And I think you knew also, from your husband's own trouble with money, that such a change, coming now, might ruin him entirely, might ruin this family entirely, this house you have lived in, and cared for, and called your own for so many years. Margaret's shoulders had begun very slightly to shake. You did not plan it with cruelty, I think, madame. You watched, at first only from your window, the habit that governed this house, the walk, the hour, the turning where no one could see. And watching became, in time, a kind of rehearsal your mind performed without your full permission, the way a worry, turned over too many times, becomes at last a plan. You went to the hedge more than once, perhaps only to see whether it could be done, whether a person standing there truly could not be seen, and each time you did not act, until the morning you did. I only meant to speak with her, Margaret said at last, the words breaking loose all at once, low and ragged. I meant to ask her, to beg her, not to do it, not to take it all away from Rupert after everything, after all the years we've given this place. And she wouldn't hear it. She said it wasn't my concern, she said. Her voice cracked entirely. She turned to walk on, as though I were nothing at all, as though 30 years of my life in this house were nothing at all to be discussed with me. And I don't fully remember what happened next. I remember the stick was in my hand, hers, that she'd set down a moment against the hedge, and I remember she fell, and I remember standing there after, not being able to make myself believe it, the way Agnes said she couldn't believe it either, only I knew from the first second, and I have known every second since. The room had gone entirely silent but for her weeping, not the performed, careful grief Poirot had noted on his first afternoon, but something rawer and much older, the grief, perhaps, of a woman who had lost not only her husband's aunt, but some clean, uncomplicated version of herself she would not get back again. Rupert had risen from his chair, his face white with a shock that Poirot judged, watching him closely, to be entirely genuine. Whatever his faults, whatever his careless talk of inheritances and estates, he had plainly known nothing at all of what his wife had done in his name, and for his sake. He took a single step toward her, and then stopped, as though the distance between them had become, in the space of a few sentences, far greater than the width of the room. Japp stepped forward then, quiet and businesslike, and the necessary words were said, and Margaret Vantry went with Constable Whitfield, without resistance, almost, Poirot thought, with something like relief, the relief of a habit finally broken, a silence finally emptied of its terrible weight. Later, standing once more at the second turning of the rose garden path, with the evening settling grey and quiet over the hedges, Poirot found Dorothy beside him, her arms wrapped against the evening chill. "I keep thinking," she said, "that if she'd only varied her walk once, just once, in 30 years, none of this would have happened." "Perhaps," Poirot agreed, "or perhaps some other door would have opened instead, in some other corner of a life so carefully arranged that it left no room for the unexpected. A habit, mademoiselle, is not dangerous in itself. It becomes dangerous only when it is so unbreakable, so utterly reliable, that another person may build a plan upon it as confidently as a mason builds upon stone." He looked toward the tall dark hedges, the narrow blind corridor between them, already fading into the dusk. "Your aunt trusted her own routine absolutely. She never once imagined that the very steadiness she prized above all things was the one thing that made her, in the end, so easy to find." They walked back toward the house together in silence, past the sundial, past the roses now growing dim in the failing light, and Poirot, glancing once more over his shoulder at the quiet, ordinary garden that had held its secret so patiently for so long, permitted himself, at last, the small satisfaction of a case well finished, and the quieter, more sobering thought that the safest habits, so often, are the ones we never think to question at all.